Thank you so much, Brett, and hello to everybody. I'd just like to start by acknowledging the Turrbal and the Yuggera peoples as the First Nation owners of the lands where QUT now stands. So Kath and I wanted to talk today about the tax treatment of crypto and some of the issues that this could raise, both for the ATO potentially and for the miners or the traders or investors. So Kath has also identified where issues can arise in insolvency, where companies are holders and traders of crypto. And we would love to hear from anybody here who perhaps has some thoughts on how some of these issues might be addressed. So when Kath and I were discussing what we wanted to talk about today, we realised that we see a lot of really interesting philosophical issues around the taxation of crypto. And we're not going to have time to discuss all of them today. I'm a little bit nervous I'm going to take up too much time with what I'm going to say. But the issues arise from what we see as applying existing rules to something that is an entirely new medium of exchange that doesn't necessarily exhibit the same features as the existing mediums of exchange. So I don't think I'm going to get time to get through everything that needs to be raised, because you could talk about this issue for quite some time, particularly if I started to talk about what money actually is. I could spend a lot of time talking about that and its history and its purpose, but I don't think I'd do it as well as it's been done elsewhere. So I'd encourage you to go and have a look at some of the books that cover this topic really, really well. But basically, just as a starting point, so money's obviously a necessity to overcome the problems of a coincidence of wants. So as the slide indicates, bartering works extremely well when there's a coincidence of wants between parties. But where there's not, there needs to be something that allows those parties to trade. So that's really the purpose of money. Everybody can get what they want, even when they don't want precisely the same things. And in this respect, cryptocurrency is also, of course, a medium of exchange. So if we stick with bartering in a specialised society, it's going to become a long chain of exchanges, and in each step of the chain, you're going to have a negotiation, which in economic terms is an inefficient process. So this is where money is needed. That way negotiation can occur in more efficient terms. Now, negotiation, depending on who you ask, this is not necessarily my view, but depending on who you ask, negotiations through crypto can actually be easier. There are a lot less transaction costs in the exchange potentially, especially when you're looking at moving money overseas. So some commentators suggest that we should be encouraging the use of crypto, and one way to do this, of course, is through the taxation system. And we could get into a whole big discussion about the environmental debate, and I've heard both people refuting this argument on both sides, and I'm not going to do that here because it's not really the point of the presentation. So the requirements of money, I've listed those on the slide here, and this indicates that crypto has a lot of the same characteristics, except for anybody who's been watching the market of late is the stability aspect. So Bitcoin, for instance, it was near 90,000 Australian dollars in March for one Bitcoin, and it's now sitting, I looked at it about an hour ago, I think it was 43,000 Australian dollars, and it's probably different now. So that volatility is clearly something that's potentially problematic when we're talking about a medium of exchange. So the recognition of the similarities in cryptocurrency and in money, as we've traditionally identified it, it's led to the evolution of this term digital currency. And this, of course, as most people would know, led to some legislative changes through the GST legislation, not necessarily through income tax. So this is sort of the first point that may be a cause for confusion for some miners or investors. For instance, they may think they just deal with cryptocurrency in the same way as they deal with money, but this, of course, is not the case. So the other thing about this definition is that it does cause a little bit of confusion, as I've discovered just a couple of days ago when I was talking to some technical people about it and talking about what is covered in digital currency. So this doesn't cover all crypto by any extent, and the definition is a little bit fuzzy in some areas, and it certainly doesn't cover NFTs. So if I get time, I'm going to talk briefly about NFTs today. and show how those are different to other types of cryptocurrency. So things that are not digital currency, and I've taken this directly from the ATO website. I'm not going to read this out. This is these things listed here. They're not digital currency. And in this respect, there are a number of digital currencies that provide entitlement to something else that may not necessarily be obvious. And I didn't even really make the connection between Ether and being entitled to something else, as was pointed out to me recently, that Ether gives you the right to allocate resources on the network so that these decentralized applications such as smart contracts can actually execute. So the ATO site directly suggests that Ether will be digital currency, but when you apply a strict application of it, it doesn't necessarily fit. So it's perhaps an example of really needing to understand the technology in order to regulate it, which is something of a problem, of course, for something as new as crypto. So a cryptocurrency is a subset of digital currency. Cryptocurrency, it's a digital or virtual currency. It's secured by cryptography, and this arguably makes it nearly impossible to counterfeit or double spend. So these are systems that allow for secure payments online, which is denominated in terms of virtual tokens. And so these are represented by ledger entries on the system. So Bitcoin, as most people would be aware, so Bitcoin is the token of value, as all cryptocurrencies are. But blockchain, so Bitcoin is on the blockchain network. There's also distributed ledger technology, of course, it's not necessarily blockchain, but Bitcoin is on the blockchain network, and that's essentially the database where the token of values is stored. And it is, of course, a floating currency. It's not linked to any commodity at all. So something else I just wanted to flag prior to looking at specific scenarios is that mining occurs all over the world. So this means that information is contained in servers everywhere. So when miners are in one location or resident in one location, then there's potentially no residency issues. But I've read about the ability to avoid paying tax through simply changing your residency, and particularly doing this if there's been a big windfall in terms of the market. And so pretty much not cashing in, or not cashing in on your cryptocurrency until you've changed location, and then once you've done that, paying the lower tax rate in particular tax havens. And so that's an interesting thing, that sort of crypto allows potentially people to avoid taxation in that way. So at this stage, there's a number of different rules associated with the taxation of crypto. And one of the big issues that I see with this is that there's not that many tax professionals who understand both the technology and the tax requirements. So this may mean that there's going to be confusion, not only for tax professionals, but also for the people who trade in it, such as the miners, the traders, and the investors. And these people, they're not all cashed up having millions and millions of dollars through crypto. Some of them are just, struggling as well, and may have no idea about how the tax treatment of all of this. So they may not be engaging with the ATO website trying to figure out how they're actually going to deal with it. And some of these, as you'll find as we go through them, some of the ways that it's dealt with are actually quite complicated. So in Australia, most transactions involving cryptocurrency will, as you would expect, result in an income tax liability. However, its precise treatment and reporting requirements will depend on how it is derived and how it's used and how it's disposed of. So for instance, cryptocurrencies, of course, they involve the initial mining transactions, and in these circumstances, most miners will need to declare their profits as ordinary income. So the value to be declared, of course, will reflect the market value on the point of cryptocurrency at the point of mining, and I'll talk more about that in just a second. So once the coin is used, so another taxable event will likely be created, and it depends on whether the miner is using the coin or whether it's an investor that's using the coin. So I'll talk about each of those just briefly now. So of course, deriving Bitcoin through mining will be a form of income, particularly if it's something more than a hobby, of course. And I won't go into the hobby versus business because everybody here would be aware of that. So the income, however, is going to be calculated on the basis of the trading stock provisions. So if you're using the market value, so this could mean drastic losses or gain in different years for these miners, and they're liable to pay tax even if they have not converted their crypto to fiat currency, of course. So this could mean that some miners may be forced to actually convert their crypto to pay their tax bill, but that's sort of how taxation works. So it's they're not alone there. So there are simplified rules around trading stocks that are applicable, but that's only for trading stock changes of up to $5,000 from what I can gather. So this may mean that miners, they may have to do a stock take or market valuation at the beginning and the end of the income year. And I've never had to do that, but I'm just wondering if that's quite a complicated process. So there could be significant changes in value and miners may be unaware of their liability, particularly if they haven't converted their crypto to normal currency. So they may think that their tax liability doesn't occur until this is done. And in fact, I've heard that in a lot of instances, which could mean that they're going to end up not paying their tax and getting into some trouble for doing this. So the next category that I just wanted to touch on briefly are traders, and this is treated in much the same way as miners. So a trader is obviously active in crypto as a means to generate income. They're operating from a business setup. So they're buying and selling for short-term gains and running a crypto exchange. So that's, again, treated as trading stock. And they may be better placed in how to deal with this, given that they're, going through the complicated process of running an exchange. But the category that is going to be applicable to most people is going to be that of a crypto investor. So most people who hold crypto are going to be considered to be investors. So individuals investing in a future return. So they buy and sell crypto as a personal investment with the goal of gradually building wealth over the extended period. So this, of course, is going to be dealt with through the capital gains tax regime, and this may be reasonably easy for people to figure out, as it's, of course, very similar to the traditional form of capital gains tax. But one of the big issues here that I can see is that any disposal at all is going to result in a CGT event. And I've heard about investors who get in and they trade their crypto daily, so switching from one coin to another on a daily basis to make the most out of this volatile market. And sometimes they do that several times a day, yet not to the point that they're considered to be traders. And so they're going to have so many different CGT events over the course of the year, given that any disposal is going to be considered an event, which could mean it's quite difficult for them to figure out their tax bill. So very briefly, so moving on from this, from those issues that we can see with the way that it's dealt with traditionally, there is a loophole for crypto users within the Australian tax law, and this is for a personal use asset. And again, there's quite a bit of confusion around this, including for me, around the personal use asset exception. So it's not one that many holders will be able to access. So the ATO is reasonably clear that if you're holding it for the purpose of making a profit, then this is not going to apply to you. But they don't give any timeframes or any sort of objective standards as to when that's going to occur. So simply put, if the crypto coin is held for the personal use, so to go out and to buy personal items, then it's going to have this exception of being a personal use asset. So this means that any gains made from an acquisition of the asset less than $10,000 will not result in a capital gains tax event. And the question that it's raised for me, and I'm quite open to hearing how this is treated, is if somebody goes out and purchases crypto for $5,000 in one day and then you purchase it for $5,000 in the next day, is it going to be considered a set, just like ordinary personal use assets, or is it going to be considered differently? Because that would be a way to manipulate the system potentially. Hold on to it for a short period of time, perhaps buy a few things with it. Obviously, you can't buy a Tesla with it at the moment, but there's other personal items that you can buy through using cryptocurrency and perhaps not have to pay any tax on it. So I'm not 5 minutes. Okay, well, I'm going to hand over here to Cath. I'm not going to get on to fungible tokens, but there's a number of other important issues, particularly the loss of cryptocurrency that I haven't covered. So I'm going to pass over to Cath now. Sorry to take up so much of your time, Cath.
That's perfectly fine. Because what I'm going to talk about is very much a work in progress, and hopefully my microphone is working. Yep, good. Testing new earpods. Just following on from what Felicity was talking about, there are a number of issues that are going to come up in insolvency, and one of the problems is that, Felicity was saying, well, it requires that professionals know about the tech as well as the tax law. But when you add the layer of insolvency to that, then you've got a position where you need to have people who understand the tech, the tax law, and the insolvency law, and honestly, who would do that to their own heads. So the intersection between tax and insolvency law is something that, I've always been really interested in, because these areas of law tend to develop in their own silos. And there's not usually any consideration from one or the other as to the objectives of the other piece of legislation. And that gives rise to a number of problematic drafting issues, if nothing else. So when we first started talking about this, that was what I sort of started thinking about and wanting to explore a little further. And this is, as I said, just my initial early thoughts as to some of the problems that we have when we've got quite old law. So for those of you that know anything about insolvency law, the Bankruptcy Act is quite, it was redrafted, but it's still quite based on quite old law. The Corporations Act has been redrafted several times, but it still refers to some fairly early principles. And we know that most of the Tax Act, where this is going to arise, really comes from the early 1900s. So all of these laws are drafted at points in time where the concept of cryptocurrency or any of those digital currencies or any of the other issues like NFTs and crazy cat videos are going to just not have been within the scope of the drafting. So I've seen people talk about what are the issues for insolvency generally, and I've seen people talk about what are the issues for tax. I haven't seen much dialogue around the issues for tax or the ATO as a creditor in an insolvency process, or what that means for the corporation who is becoming insolvent or the person who is becoming bankrupt. So in terms of the issues for insolvency, one of the key issues is this tracing of assets. So how do you go about tracing and valuing assets where the identification of the assets is held in quite an anonymous way through the blockchain process? And then there's a fundamental issue of what constitutes property for the purpose of these legislations. So the fundamental point of insolvency law really is to try to have a means by which the assets of the insolvent entity are collected and redistributed to the remaining creditors. That becomes quite difficult when you've got this currency that's in constant flux. And a lot of it will depend, of course, too, as to whether whether the company or the bankrupt is an investor or a trader, or whether we're looking at this through the lens of the debtor or the creditor. So that raises all sorts of other issues. So as I said, there's a kind of fundamental question as to whether the currency itself is property. Under our law in Australia, probably our definition of property in the Corps Act and the Bankruptcy Act are sufficient enough to say that a digital currency is an asset, but it would be most likely akin to a intangible asset, and so therefore couldn't be subject to any security type interest.
Cath, you got 1 more minute?
Yes, okay. Well, then I will talk through some of these things. Well, so property is, you can see there I've got, property as being a main issue. But so when we get to that, okay, if it's property, then the question is it a CGT asset? We have this issue of the timing of the event. So the way the Act is currently drafted, it's when a contract's entered into, like we've got your A1 event, when the contract's entered into for disposal or when the ownership changes, and I'm not sure how that fits. But more importantly, I'm not sure how the attribution rules in Division 106 are going to work. Sorry, not attribution, the vesting rules in Division 106 are going to work in insolvency. I'm not sure how the actual claim or the proof of claims that are required to be put in by the creditor, which in this case might be the ATO, is going to work if the definition is debts payable or claims against the company. And there's an equivalent in the Bankruptcy Act for circumstances which occurred before the relevant date. How does that work when we're looking at cryptocurrency? We've talked about the volatility of the market and the valuation issues. Then that becomes even more problematic because one of the requirements, of course, with a company is that the liquidator or the receiver has to give notice to the ATO and set aside the amount that would typically be paid in pari passu portion to the commissioner. We've got other mechanisms in the Tax Act, such as the use of a garnishee notice, but it talks about tax-related liabilities, which are very specifically defined. And it also refers to the, when you're issuing the garnishee notice, it's in relation to third parties who owe or may later owe money. So it uses money as its definition term, is cryptocurrency money.
Sorry, Kath, we're going to have to just...
Yep, no, I know. So I was just going to say, I was literally wrapping up and going to say, I'm going to leave that there because I think that's enough food for thought.